right, so I want to talk about how the early Muslims understood the attributes. So I want to start by looking at the first tafsir ever written, actually. And this is actually might be the first, one of the earliest sources when it comes to the attributes, right? It was from Muqatil bin Suleiman, and he lived at this time very early. Somebody did write a commentary on it. I believe he's from Al Azhar, Abdullah Mahmud Shihata, right? And he gets a few ideas in there, and he does mention this right in the introduction to the book. Muqatil's interpretation, meaning tafsir, is the earliest complete interpretation of the Quran that has reached us. That's pretty important, and we actually have the whole thing, I believe, which is pretty cool. um, there's another quote, and I found this not just from Shihada but other people. The interpretation, or rather tafsir, of Al-Kalbi is like the tafsir of Muqatil, meaning that there was another early tafsir that we heard of from a guy named Al-Kalbi, and it comes and it's they say it resembles Muqatil's. This is from an early source. I'm not sure exactly who that is or what year that guy is from, but apparently that's what he said. So what this means is that the tafsir of Muqatil reflects what other tafsirs of that time period said, right? Now, what I want to go into is look at some of the verses. Now, let's look at the verses of the attributes and what Muqatil said about it. Pretty important. So, this is the verse, right? Except for his face. This is a famous, everything is perishable except for his face. You know that one of the attributes. And interestingly, what Muqatil writes is, uh, meaning, except for his authority, essentially, right? The ruling, the judiciary, right? And so he takes a tafsir, he takes a metaphorical approach to that. That's important here. And you can keep going, and you find that Shihata, who wrote the commentary of it in the 20th century, he mentions a few things, um, right? Meaning other than him, right? And this is an example, Muqatil, glory of his face, none other than him. There's a few of them. We can keep going. Why don't I just find more? For example, Muqatil also. Why don't I find the direct examples instead of what Shihada wrote? All right, so this is directly from Muqatil. Now, I just want to make sure you know that Shihada does agree with what I'm saying here, right? He writes all about it, but I didn't want to go over what he wrote too much. But it's not like I'm the only one who saw this, right? So this is verse 76. Sorry, chapter 7, Surah 76, verse 9. He mentions the face of Allah, and Muqatil bin Suleiman writes, the pleasure of God, right? And so he understood it as the pleasure. That's important. And you keep going. This is another one, verse about the eyes, right? He says, with our knowledge, right? And this is an early tafsir, guys. And he does this for a few of them. For the hands, he says, what we have done, right? So he takes the hands to mean the action, right? This is another one. Let me see if this one. So this is another one where he says God's hand is locked up from giving. Remember that one. And in this context, he basically understands it as they were withheld from the good. That's what they were saying, right? The shin, and he actually quotes Ibn Abbas. Actually, I think that might be the root of where we get that. By the way, because you know how we always find this in every tafsir. Ibn Abbas said this. I don't know where else people get it from. It might be that they're all getting it from this tafsir, because I believe a lot of tafsirs that were written after Muqatil used his tafsir as somewhat of a basis, right? Because that's kind of how they do things. When you write a book, you usually look at what other people wrote. So I mean, it's probably they looked at his. I think if you look at Tabari's tafsir, it has a lot of the same, uh, stuff like mentioning Ibn Abbas, or using somewhat of a metaphor for this or that. And over here, it is severe, right? That's what he means by the shin. That one I'm sure most of you know. And here's another one: the hands of Abu Lahab were perished. He says, meaning Abu Lahab is lost, right? That's a metaphor. This is the only one where it's not a metaphor. Istiwa, right? He just says it, meaning he's settled. All right. So that is not a metaphor. Shihata does try to argue that he had a, he was influenced by Christianity when he said that. But the literal meaning of istiwa is settle. So you don't have to be influenced for that to be the conclusion. I think the chair he also does the same thing. Let's see. No. All right. And so this is what Shihata writes. He was not resembling them in the verse of the face, the hand, the eye, right? But we want to keep going. Now, here's what's important about Muqatil bin Sulaiman. The Salafis will say, oh, he was this, he was that. In the end, Ibn Taymiyyah does say in Minhaj as-Sunnah Nabawiyah, volume 2, page 618 to 620, he actually writes this. As for Muqatil, God knows the truth about his condition. And Abul Hasan al-Ashari is the one who transferred the information we have about him, right? But he claims, Ibn Taymiyyah, which is probably might be true, that he got that from the Mu'tazila, right? That information. And in there is deviation. Essentially, it was very critical of him, and it called him an anthropomorphist. That's the popular idea of Muqatil bin Sulaiman, that he's an anthropomorphist. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah is saying that information about him comes from possibly the Mu'tazila, so we don't know if it's actually true. Now, here's another quote that Ibn Taymiyyah quotes. As Shafi'i said, whoever wants interpretation is dependent on Muqatil, and whoever desires jurisprudence is dependent on Abu Hanifa. Remember what I said earlier about how a lot of the Mufassirin may have depended on Muqatil's work. They may have worked on it. It was kind of the basis of the other tafsir. Because you do see some evidence of that, because there's some reoccurring quotes, for example, between Tabari's tafsir and Muqatil's. So this quote here from a Shafi might be true, based on that. So, and this is what Ibn Taymiyyah quotes, so I'm assuming he believes this. And what they say is that he wasn't that great in hadith, right? So some of the hadiths in his tafsir, for example, it says Ibn Abbas said, but there's no chain. But then again, remember, Muqatil lived very close. I believe he might have lived at the same time as him. No, right? But he lived very close to his time, so you didn't need him directly, even though it is a broken chain, but it's not a big chain that's broken. It's not like a 200-year gap. And here's the important part. There's no doubt in Muqatil's knowledge of tafsir of the Quran, and that is true. If you read his tafsir, it's very good. I read it, a lot of it. You could tell he has knowledge of the Bible, and he makes some good arguments, and it's actually a very good historical source because he talks about, what the people of Arabia believed before, and stuff like that. And so he lived so close to that time, so they still had that knowledge. You know what I mean? So it's a pretty valuable source. They denied him his knowledge, essentially, right? But really, you could tell he has the knowledge, right? And some people said about him he was a righteous man, right? So that's important. I do want to look at what other people said. This is from Tadib al-Tadrib from Abu Hajar al-Asqalani, and he says, this is a quote, which may or may not be true, but it's Abu Hanifa said, two evil opinions come to us from the east. Jahm is a negator of the attributes, and Muqatil, who overly affirms them, essentially, is the anthropomorphist, right? Because that was the popular opinion about him. But that's why Shihada, the guy I was mentioning earlier from the Al-Azhar, why he talked about how Muqatil is not a resembler, right? He's not an anthropomorphist, because if you look at his tafsir, he isn't, right? He takes a metaphorical approach, ironically, does the opposite. But he does say that istiwa means settle, but, some people, I believe, may have said that, right? Anyways, let's keep going. Abu Hanifa said Jahm was excessive in denial until he essentially said that God is not existent. Muqatil was excessive in affirmation until he made God look like his creation. There's interesting stuff. We can keep going. Look, and it says here that there's a tension occurred between Muqatil and Jahm, right? So Jahm and Muqatil each put out a book against each other, but we don't have that book right now. But that's pretty interesting, whether it's true or not. But that's, it's reported, right? And I did mention this. I wanted to find an alternative source for this quote. from that Ibrahim, whoever this is, interpretation of al-Kalbi is like the tafsir al-Muqatil, right? Now, what I wanted to make as an argument is that, we're going to keep going here, is that if, okay, so the metaphorical interpretation of the attributes, the claim is that it originates with the Jahmiyyah, right? Isn't that what they say? Well, if it's in Muqatil's tafsir, then, and he was in opposition to Jahm, and he even wrote a book against him, then I don't think it makes sense that that originates with Jahm, because that was his opponent. So this is my own conclusion, and I'm a historian, so I think it's okay if I make a conclusion or my own assumption. It might not be true or not, but this is what I believe, is that because Arabic, and here I do have a source for it, this is just a modern source. Arabic is a higher utilization of metaphorical expressions than most other languages, right? And it was a very poetic language at the time. So the idea that, there's this prevailing idea among the Salafi movement that the average person wouldn't have understood that it was a metaphor. For example, curse the hands of Abu Lahab. Did it really mean his actual hands, right? Or was he talking about, essentially, you know his action, or his doing? Curse them, curse what his hands have done. That makes sense, and I think the people understood that, right? I think the people of the time of the Quran understood poetry and metaphor. So the idea that the attributes are not a metaphor, and this is all from Jahmiyyah, I don't think is true, because we find it even in the earliest tafsir. And that tafsir is not just, apparently, Al-Kalbi, who was another major tafsir at that time, is similar to it. So he might have had the same thing there, right? And Al-Shafi apparently has approved of that tafsir, right? As according to that quote. So that shows you that what I think is that, um, I just think that the idea of the some of the attributes being understood as metaphor is not something that just came from like people who were trying to hide the truth or whatever, or the Jahmiyyah. I think it comes from people just understanding the language that way because they understood metaphor, right? And I think there's evidence of that, right? Muqatil and Jahm opposed each other. If they opposed each other, why would he have the same position? Why would he go and get the same position as him and take it as a metaphor, right? I think that's it. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah, if you're still confused about what I'm trying to say here, you can ask me, but I think you get the point.